Hello and welcome to the ORM Mastery course. This tutorial is part of a bigger course which you can access via the YouTube edition playlist link, which you'll find in the video description. If you really like this tutorial and want to learn more, then please check out our Django ORM Mastery course on Udemy. The link to the course, which will always provide the best price, can be found in the video description. In the previous tutorials, we have started to familiarize ourselves with creating a new custom field and some of the features or initial features we might consider when building a new custom field. In this tutorial, we're going to work through an exercise which is going to slowly introduce more advanced concepts when creating custom fields. In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to subclass from an existing Django field type. The field type that we work with in Django is going to be different from the field type that we're going to use in the database. So in this tutorial, we're going to use the dbType function, which we will learn that allows us to specify the data type to store the data in the database table. Utilizing the fromDbValue function, we will learn that we can convert the value returned by the database and convert it into a Python object, which we can utilize then within our application. And then finally, we'll learn the basics of utilizing the getPrepValue, which is essentially the reverse of the fromDbValue. So here we are going to prepare the value before then passing it over to the database. So let's jump back into the code. This is where we left off from the previous tutorial. Now you can follow this tutorial utilizing your own code base, or you can download the code from the tutorial resources. What we're building in this tutorial is a field which is going to allow users to type in a hex color. And we're going to take that hex color value and we're going to convert that into an integer. And that is what we're then going to store in the database. So what we're going to see in this tutorial is a whole range of different techniques whereby we can specify a built-in field, which isn't the same type of field or field type as the field type that we're going to use in the database. That's the important bit. And then we're going to learn how we can then convert those values so that we can utilize them both in our application and store it within our database. The user is going to enter a hex color. So a color hex code is a hexadecimal way to represent a color in RGB format by combining three values. We're going to allow the users to enter hexadecimal value, which is going to represent a color. So we're going to have a new field here called color. Now I'm going to be utilizing the British spelling. And so therefore we're going to need some sort of custom field, which is going to allow the user to type in the hexadecimal value of a color. And then we're going to convert that into an integer and save that into the database. So let's go ahead and give this a name. And that name, a field name, is going to be called hex color. So I use the American spelling here, hex color field. And that's then, the hex color field. So we're going to need to build this. So we're going to import this in from our fields. So we're going to be utilizing a separate module field file to create our hex color field, like we have been doing in the previous tutorial. So underneath the previous, if you're following this step by step, let's go ahead and create a new class. We're going to call that class hex color field. And then we go for a pass here. So the first thing we need to think about is, well, how do we actually want to represent that data while working with it in our Django application? Now, a hex color value is typically made up of numbers and letters. So letters A to F and then 0 to 9. So that fits nicely into a character field. So that's the plan here. So we're going to extend from the character field here. So models dot char field. So this is our setup. If you remember, we're going to be subclassing character field, which is a subclass of the field class. So we are going to inherit all the methods and attributes from both the character field and field into our new custom field. So let's start with the initialization override, if you like. So, well, actually, we're probably going to need a description, right? So let's give it a description equals, let's call this a string. So this is going to be a string field. essentially a character field for hexadecimal color. Can I use the American spelling? Hexadecimal values. There we go. So there's our description. So let's now go for our initialization function. So this was introduced in the previous tutorial, so I won't say too much here, or explain too much here, but we've got our initialization function, which is going to run when we instantiate or run this class. So that takes in self and our args arguments and keyword arguments. Okay. So we've decided that, well, a hex value is typically 6 characters. So let's set the keyword argument max. Remember, we are using a character field here, so it does have a mandatory max length requirement. So we are going to specify the max length, and that's going to be 6. That's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and now run super. Remember, essentially what we're doing here with super is we're just grabbing the function from the class that we've inherited from, and we're just going to run this override. So we're going to add this to the initialization function, thus applying this to the parameters of the max length parameter, which is then going to be applied to the field. So let's pass in args and quarks and our keywords. Okay. So now we have a mandatory or a static 6, maximum length of 6 characters for our custom field. So as I explained, we're going to start off here as a character field. So whilst we're working with this data within our application, it's going to be in this format of a character field. And when we save this data to the database, we want it to be an integer. So the actual field type that we're going to use in our database for this data is going to be an integer. So to specify that, we can specify the DB type. So when our data is created, so when our model is migrated, this is going to be initiated and thus used to then specify on the database side what type of field we want to use for this particular column. So let's now return. So we're going to specify, in this case, an integer. Now, we can also specify the length, or specify the size of the integer as well. Now, this is important that if you know what type of database that you're working with, then it's worth then looking into that database documentation and getting the correct terminology. For example, in a Postgres database, it might be called integer. And if you're working in another database, it might be specified as simply just int, for example. So you need to make sure that you're using the right terminology here, which matches your database technology. So as I previously mentioned, what's going to happen when this is migrated, our database is going to be informed that this column, or this field, sorry, is going to be utilizing and should be saved as an integer with a, and this 3 here is just a potentially optional parameter. I'm just putting this in place to specify the fact you can specify the size of this particular field. So on the database side, a certain amount of space is allocated for particular fields so that you can store data within it. And of course, if you can specify the field size, potentially you can reduce the amount or the size of your database because it isn't saving a certain amount of size for that particular type of data. So imagine if the size, for example, was 10, just 10, and our data only took up 1, we're essentially wasting 9. So by specifying the size of our field, it does and can potentially avoid or reduce the size of our database ultimately as we add more data to it. So next up then, let's go for thinking about converting our value. So we know that when our data is returned, let's go for putting our data into a database first. So what we want to do is we want to prepare the value from a character field here, which is essentially just a string. and we want to convert that into the format that's going to be then utilized in our database. So an integer here. So let's first actually translate it and tell Django that our data needs to be converted, or this field data needs to be converted into the correct format. So to do that, we have the get prep value function, and that takes in self and then the value that we want to change, want to manipulate, want to work with. Okay, so here what we can do is we can simply go ahead and we could build a separate function here to actually work as some sort of validator, or we could just add it here. Now, in this instance, I'm just going to add it here. So let's say if, for example, the value is none. So if we don't add a value, then obviously we want to return, I say obviously, sorry, I do that. We return none. So we're just handling the fact that if we don't receive anything in this field, then we're just going to return none. And that's absolutely fine. Nothing is then obviously saved in the database. Otherwise, we then return a value. So that needs to be an integer. So let's just cast this value into an integer. Really simple. Value. There we go. Okay, so we will need to pass in the second parameter here, and that's to tell Python what kind of number system that we're utilizing here. So we are using base 16 here because we are working with, or we're inputting the value as a hex number. So is numbers, there's going to be strings and numbers here. So we couldn't necessarily format, or we couldn't convert letters into an integer. So by specifying the fact that the number that we're working with is a hex decimal number, it does then allow us then to convert into an integer. So that's why we have this second parameter here. So now we prepared the data before it's then saved into the database. And obviously we can convert it into an integer. Let's now think about the other way around. So when we retrieve data from a database, we're going from an integer and we want to then convert it so that it is compatible with our class. And here we're utilizing a character field. So let's go ahead and give this a go. So for that, we're going to use the from DB values. So this method is going to allow us to specify how to convert our data from the database into data that we can work with in our project. So this takes in self, we're going to need the value, and we're also told in the documentation we have expression and connection. Okay, so that's what we need to pass in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and first of all, if, for example, we don't return a value, then is none. If we don't return a value because there isn't one in that particular object, let's just return none. Okay, otherwise we need to return an integer into a hex string. So to do that, we just need to format again. So with that done, let's convert into hex. So let's say, for example, the hex value, let's call this hex value equals, then we can use format. Okay, so Python format. So format, essentially we need to pass in the value and then we need to specify what it is that how we want to format. If we go over to the Python documentation, just moving down, so we're looking for format specification. You can see that we can specify the format here. So a capital X is a hex format using base 16. It will present the code or present the output using uppercase letters, or we could use the lowercase x, which would be a hex format with a lowercase capital, with lowercase letters, sorry. There we go. So this is the format that our data will be presented in. So we can pass that in. So we'll specify that we want to output with capitals. So there we go. So that's the hex value. And then we basically just need to return the hex value. So let's go do that. So return hex value. So let's try this out. Okay, let's just make sure that we don't have a database. I've deleted the SQL-like database, and then just any migrations that you might have, just remove those. So now let's go ahead and migrate. Now we have already hooked this up. It's worth noting that. So Within our models here, we've imported hex color field, and we've added that to a new field called color. Have I spelled that correctly? Doesn't look like it's hex color field models. So from fields, hex color field. Okay, maybe a spelling mistake. So let's make migrations. So everything looks absolutely fine there. Let's just go into our migrations, take a look if there's anything interesting here. So we're creating our hex color field, a max length of 6. Okay, nothing too special there. And let's go ahead now and migrate. We are going to need a color. So I'm going to select this color here. This is my red color, EC1313. Oh no, actually I prefer this one. Oh no, I like this one. 80%. E61919 if you can't see that, if it's too small. So that's my hex color. Let's now go into the shell and add this. So from ecommerce.models.models, and let's import product. Okay, so let's build this up. So product, let's give it a name. Test, and then we're going to need a product ID. Okay, and then the order field is automatically generated for us. So now we can go ahead and specify a color. So our color is going to be, remember it's a string, so we're working with a character field here. So I just paste that in. Now, it's important that most hex colors start with a hash, but we don't need the hash, so we're just assuming that doesn't exist. So you can see this is 6 characters. I'll leave it in capitals to begin with. So that's a color that we're going to be utilizing. Right, so let's just turn this into a variable. Okay, so x equals, and let's now go ahead and save this. So I didn't finish that off. So I needed to finish that off with the end parentheses there. So let's go for x.save. There we go. So now let's remember that the color here that we entered was E61919, and that has been converted. Let's just remember what's happened here. So we have prepped our value, and we have then converted that into a hexadecimal, an integer, sorry. So we've converted that into an integer. That's what's being saved in the database. And let's also remember that we define the database field type on the database as an integer. So let's take a look. Now I do have the SQLite Explorer, sorry, the SQLite extension installed. If you haven't already got that, SQLite extension. And then inside of here, if we go down to our database, right click, open the database. Let's go into our database. This is my product table. So let's go ahead and show the table, and you can now see that the color has been stored as an integer. So let's go ahead and return the data and see what happens, see if that works. So we should return that data, and obviously we convert that back into hex. So let's see if we can do that. So run a nice little query here, x equals product.objects.get. So let's get ID equals 1. So get the first product there. And then let's have a look. So x.color. And there we go. So you can see when we use a terminal here, in actual fact, that conversion doesn't take place. So I apologize. It was completely my fault for it not working correctly. In actual fact, I had named the function method here incorrectly. So from DB values, that was the original code. It's actual fact from DB value. So I accidentally put the S at the end there. I do apologize for that. So this function wasn't actually being initiated. So let's try that again. So x equals product objects get ID equals 1. You can see that I've got 2 items now in my database. So I just grabbed the first item. I'm not entirely sure what happened there. I think I had a print statement. I was just trying to work out what the problem was. So that won't appear on yours. And then we can go ahead and inspect. So x.color. And there we go. So you can see that we've now returned from the database and converted back into our hex color. So in addition to that, let's remember that we specified the field type. let's go back into our database, and you can now see at the bottom here, even though we're using a character field here, we should see, for example, other character fields here. You can see the data type is varchar 10. But because we've specified here in the db type method the fact we wanted to use an integer and the size of the integer, you can now see that in our database, this is an SQLite database, you can now see that the color field in actual fact has been assigned to an integer. Although that's a very basic example, that really gets into some of the important functions when building more complex custom fields. Learning how to specify the database field type. Now, of course, we could, like I alluded to in the previous tutorials, that we could create our own custom data type on the actual database, depending on the database technology we're utilizing. So that's handy. And of course, the two important functions here, from db value and get prep value. So if you're still wondering where I found all this information or where you can read more about this, don't forget to head over to the documentation. You're looking for the field API reference class field. And inside of here, you're going to see the functions that we have utilized and many more that you can take a look at and read. And there's some examples of how to utilize, as well as some additional information that we haven't included in this tutorial. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of an insight into other aspects of building a custom field.